The morning Naomi Slater buried her husband, the sky over Caldwell, Kansas had the nerve to be beautiful. It was October of 1882, and the sun came up gold and warm over the flat prairie, painting the dry grass in shades of copper and amber, as though the land itself had no idea that a woman's entire world had just collapsed beneath her feet. Naomi stood at the graveside in her black dress, the one she had worn to her mother's funeral years before, and she held her daughter Clara's hand with a grip that was probably too tight, and she did not cry. She had already done that in the night, alone in the bed that smelled of sweat and illness, and now she had nothing left except the hard, still thing in her chest that she supposed was grief rearranging itself into something she could survive. Elijah Slater had been 34 years old. He had been strong once, broad-shouldered and full of laughter, the kind of man who could gentle a horse with a word and fix a fence line before breakfast. Then the fever came in late August, and within 6 weeks she had watched him thin down to bones and rasping breath, and there was nothing any doctor could do. The doctor in Caldwell had charged her $2.40 for his visits, and when Elijah passed, she paid the bill with the last of what they kept in the tin box behind the flour sacks. After the burial, the women of the town came. They brought pies and casseroles in sympathy, and they stood in her small kitchen and spoke in the soft, careful voices people used around grief, and Naomi thanked each one of them and meant it. But when Margaret Holt from the general store pressed an envelope into her hands and said, "The Ladies' Aid Society took up a collection," Naomi gave it back before the sentence was finished. "I appreciate the kindness," she said, and her voice was steady as iron. "But I cannot take it." Margaret blinked. "Naomi, you have a daughter and a farm with no hand to run it." "I know what I have," Naomi said. "Thank you for the pie." Margaret left with the envelope and a look on her face that was equal parts bewilderment and offense, and word spread through Caldwell the way words always did in small towns, which was immediately and completely. By the following Sunday, the entire county knew that Naomi Slater had refused charity, and the opinions were about evenly split between those who thought she was brave and those who thought she was a fool. Naomi herself thought neither. She simply could not bear it. There was something about taking money handed over in pity that felt like signing a paper that said she had failed, that Elijah had failed, that the farm and the dream and the 7 years of hard work in the Kansas sun had all amounted to nothing. She knew it was pride. She knew it in the way you know a thorn is in your boot, sharp and present, but she walked on it anyway because stopping felt worse. The farm was 40 acres northeast of town, a modest piece of ground with a small white house that needed painting, a barn that needed a new board along the south wall, a chicken coop, a kitchen garden that had gone half to seed in the weeks of nursing Elijah, and a field that she and her husband had last harvested together in the August before he got sick. The harvest had been decent but not exceptional. There was enough wheat stored to see them partway through winter, and she had 3 hens still laying, and the kitchen garden had dried beans and late squash she could put up. Clara was 9 years old and already understood, with the grave seriousness of a child who has grown up watching adults work hard and worry harder, that things were different now. She did not ask for new shoes, even though the ones she had pinched her toes. She helped her mother with the chickens and the garden without being asked. In the evenings she sat close to Naomi by the lamp and read aloud from the primer she had used at the Caldwell schoolhouse, because Naomi had told her reading every night would keep her sharp, and Clara believed her mother in everything. The weeks after the burial were a grinding kind of busy. Naomi patched the south wall of the barn herself, hauling boards and driving nails with a focus that she found was better than thinking. She restaked the kitchen garden fence where a post had rotted, washed and mended every item of clothing they owned, and took stock of the pantry with the precision of a general counting ammunition before a long campaign. November was coming. The wind off the open prairie was already carrying the first cold bite of what would become the bitter Kansas winter, and she lay awake some nights doing the mathematics of survival in her head until sleep finally took her. She needed grain, not just for the hens and for baking, but for planting next spring. If she could not put a crop in, the farm was finished and she would have to sell it, and she was not prepared to sell it. Elijah had loved this land. She had loved it too, in the way you love something you have worked alongside until you cannot tell where you end and it begins. She would plant. She would harvest. She would manage. But grain cost money, and money was the one thing she did not have enough of. She had been turning the problem over for 3 days, thinking about what she might do, whether she could take in washing from town, whether old Henderson at the grist mill might let her run a tab, when she stepped out one Monday morning in early November to feed the chickens and found a burlap sack sitting on her porch steps. It was a 50-pound sack of grain, the good kind, hard winter wheat seed. It sat squarely on the second step as though it had been placed there with deliberate care, tied at the top with a length of plain brown cord. There was no note attached, no name written on it, nothing. Naomi stood in the cold morning air and stared at it for a long moment, her breath coming out in small white clouds. The sun was not yet fully up, and the world was gray and quiet except for the sound of the wind in the dried grass and the distant complaint of one of her hens. She looked down the road that led to town. She looked out across the open field. There was no one visible anywhere in the pale early light. She carried the sack inside and set it on the kitchen table and looked at it for another long moment. Part of her wanted to load it into the wagon and drive it into Caldwell and start asking who was responsible so she could return it, because this was charity the same as the envelope from the Ladies' Aid Society, and she had already been clear about where she stood on the matter. But something about the anonymity of it stopped her. There was no benefactor to thank or refuse, no face to give it back to, no pity in someone's eyes to square herself against. It was just grain, sitting in her kitchen, with no strings attached because there was no hand holding the strings. She put the grain in the pantry. She told herself she would figure out where it came from and pay for it when she could. She told herself a lot of things. The following Monday morning the same thing happened. Another sack, same weight, same cord, same porch step, same complete absence of any indication of who had left it. Naomi found it before Clara was up and stood looking at it in the gray light with a feeling she could not quite name, something that lived between unease and a warmth she did not entirely trust. She brought it inside without a word to her daughter. By the third Monday she was awake before dawn. She had been awake before dawn for 2 weeks running, if she was being honest with herself, though she had told herself it was because she had things to think about and not because she was waiting for anything. She sat in the wooden chair by the front window with a blanket across her knees and a cup of coffee cooling in her hands, and she watched the darkness outside. The road was empty. The field was empty. The night was the deep, full black of a Kansas night without a moon, and she could see almost nothing. She heard it before she saw anything. The soft, unhurried sound of a horse moving at a walk on the dry road, hooves striking the earth with a steady patience, and then a shape resolved out of the darkness at the far end of her yard. A man on horseback, leading a second horse that carried something across its back. He dismounted a good 20 yards from the porch, moved quietly, lifted the sack from the second horse's back with the ease of someone accustomed to handling weight, and carried it to the steps. He set it down with the same careful deliberateness she had imagined when she found the first two, turned back toward the horses, and then stopped. He had seen the light of the lamp through the window. Naomi did not move. She sat very still with her coffee cup and looked out at him through the glass, and he stood in the darkness looking toward the light, and neither of them did anything for the space of several seconds that felt much longer. Then he touched the brim of his hat in a gesture that was so purely and simply respectful that it caught her somewhere in the sternum, a brief, clean acknowledgement that said he knew she was there, and he was not trying to deceive her. And then he mounted his horse and rode back toward town at the same unhurried walk. Naomi sat still for another 5 minutes after the sound of the hooves faded. Then she set down her coffee, went to the porch, picked up the sack and carried it inside. She wanted to know who he was. She wanted it with a sharpness that surprised her, because for 2 months she had been existing in a state of such focused practical necessity that wanting anything beyond grain and firewood and her daughter's well-being had seemed beside the point. But she wanted to know who this man was, this person who rode out in the dark before dawn to leave something on her porch and who touched his hat to an empty window and asked nothing. She asked around carefully. She did not want to broadcast the fact that someone had been leaving things at her farm, because she could already imagine the conversations that would generate in Caldwell, the speculations, the well-meaning prying. But she had lived in this county long enough to know how to ask an oblique question. She mentioned to Henderson at the mill that she had come across some good-quality hard winter wheat and wondered who carried that particular strain. Henderson told her most of the larger farms in the county used it, and listed half a dozen names, none of which she could attach to the solitary rider she had seen. She asked Martha Delacroix at the dry goods store if anyone had been purchasing grain in large quantities lately. Martha thought about it and said that young Jasper Wallace over at the Double Creek outfit had come in just last week and bought a considerable amount, more than she would have expected for his own use. Martha said it in the casually informative way she said everything, but her eyes were watching Naomi with the alert interest of a woman who was already constructing a story. Jasper Wallace, Naomi said, as though it were no particular name. I don't know that I know him. He's been riding for Holt's outfit near on 2 years now, Martha said. Came up from Texas, I think, or maybe Oklahoma Territory. Quiet type. Pays his bills on time and doesn't cause trouble in the saloon, which puts him ahead of half the men in this county. How old is he? Naomi asked, and then immediately wished she hadn't because Martha's eyes went sharper. Oh, I'd say 28, 29 somewhere in there, Martha said, and she was watching Naomi with the full focused attention of a woman who had just been handed the first piece of a puzzle she very much intended to complete. Naomi thanked her and bought her flour and walked out with her chin level, and she thought about Jasper Wallace the whole drive home. She knew the Double Creek outfit. It was one of the larger ranching operations in the county, running cattle on the open range east of town, owned by a man named Holt who was related, she thought, to Margaret Holt of the Ladies' Aid Society, though she was not entirely sure of the connection. The riders who worked the ranch were a varied lot, some of them serious working men, and some of them the drifting kind who moved on when the mood took them. She had never paid particular attention to any of them. She tried to remember if she had ever seen Jasper Wallace at any of the town gatherings, the church socials, the cattle auctions, the 4th of July celebrations in the years before Elijah got sick. She could not place a face to the name, and yet the name had a solidity to it in her mind now, as though it had always been there, and she had simply not noticed it. She almost went to the Double Creek ranch to confront him directly. She had the impulse for a full day, that same iron straightforwardness that had made her give back the Ladies' Aid envelope, the instinct to meet a thing head-on and be honest about it. But she thought about the way he had touched his hat to her window, and she thought about the fact that he had been leaving the grain without a name, and she understood, in a way that required no explanation, that the anonymity was not an accident. He was leaving it without his name specifically so that she could not come back at him with her pride. It was the most thoughtful thing anyone had done for her since Elijah died, and it had been done by a stranger, and that fact sat in her chest in a complicated and tender knot. She let the 4th Monday come and go. She did not watch from the window this time by choice. She found the sack in the morning and brought it in and said nothing to Clara, who was beginning to notice the increasing fullness of the pantry shelves with the quiet watchfulness of a child who understands more than adults give her credit for. Clara had not asked. Naomi was grateful for that. December came with a bite. The temperature dropped hard in the second week, and the wind came straight off the open plains with nothing to slow it, carrying sleet that stung like needles, and turned the road to mud that froze overnight into a surface like cracked pottery. Naomi kept the stove burning and mended harnesses and taught Clara her arithmetic, and worked at the loom in the evenings making cloth she could trade for what she could not grow. And she thought about the fact that a man was riding out to her farm in this weather before dawn because he had decided on his own and without asking her that she needed grain. She baked a pie. She told herself it was because she had a good store of dried apples, and it was something Clara loved, and they had not had a proper pie in some time. She told herself it was not because she was planning anything. She told herself this very firmly while she was crimping the crust, and while she was sliding it into the oven, and while she was setting it on the windowsill to cool. The next morning she put the pie in a cloth and drove the wagon into Caldwell to the Double Creek Ranch. She had never been a woman who did things in half measures, and she was not about to start. The Double Creek Ranch was a working spread, larger than her farm, with a main house set back from the road, and a series of outbuildings and corrals where horses moved in the cold morning air. 2 hands were visible near the barn, working at something she could not identify from the road, and one of them looked up as her wagon came through the gate. She drove to the barn and climbed down with the pie in her hands and asked the nearer of the 2 men if Jasper Wallace was about. The man, young and raw-boned with a cheerful, open face, pointed toward the far corral where a third figure was working with a horse. "That's him right there," he said, and he looked at the cloth-wrapped pie with undisguised curiosity. Naomi walked to the corral fence. The man inside had his back to her, moving with a horse in a slow, deliberate circle, his body language easy and patient, and she had a moment to look at him before he heard her footsteps on the frozen ground. He was lean, not tall but solidly built, with dark hair under a dusty brown hat and the kind of competent, economical movement that came from years of physical work. His coat was worn at the elbows, and the back of his neck was brown from a summer of sun that was only just beginning to fade. He turned when he heard her, and she had her first clear look at Jasper Wallace's face. It was a good face, not pretty but honest, with dark eyes set under straight brows, a jaw that carried 2 days of stubble, and a quality around the eyes that she could only describe as careful, the look of a man who paid attention to things and kept what he noticed to himself. He was younger than she had somehow expected him to look, not young exactly, but with none of the hardened cynicism she associated with the drifting ranch hand type. He looked at her for 1 second with the pure, still look of a man who has been found out and is deciding how to respond, and then something in his expression settled into a kind of quiet resolution. "Mrs. Slater," he said. His voice was low and even with the faint trace of somewhere south in the vowels. "You know me," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." He came to the fence, resting his forearms on the top rail. He did not offer an explanation or an excuse. "Then you know I came to return a kindness," she said, and she held out the pie. He looked at the pie for a moment and then back at her face, and the corner of his mouth moved in something that was not quite a smile, but was the nearest thing to one she had seen from him yet. "I can't tell you what you're returning it for," he said, "since I don't know what you mean." "Jasper Wallace," she said, "I have been running a farm by myself in the middle of a Kansas winter, and I have a 9-year-old girl, and I have more things to occupy my attention than playing word games about grain sacks. So I am going to thank you directly, and I am going to ask you to keep your name on the next one." He was quiet for a long moment. The horse moved behind him. Wind came across the yard and lifted the edge of her coat. "There's a reason I left it without a name," he said finally. "I know," she said. "You thought I wouldn't take it otherwise." "Would you have?" She considered that honestly. "Probably not." Another silence. He took the pie from her hands and his fingers briefly touched hers through the cloth and neither of them remarked on it. "I heard your husband was a good man," he said. "I heard you were a good farmer. It seemed a waste to let the farm go under when it didn't have to." "You could have asked," she said. "You had enough people telling you what you needed," he said, with a quiet directness that surprised her, because it was true and he was not supposed to know it, which meant he had been paying attention for longer than the grain deliveries. She looked at him and he looked at her, and the cold wind moved across the corral. "All right," she said at last. "The pie is my way of putting an account number on what I owe you so I know I can pay it back." He almost smiled again. "An apple pie against 6 sacks of grain seems favorable to me." "7," she said. "7 then." He looked down at the pie and back at her. "You want to come in? Mary, the cook here, makes coffee that won't embarrass itself." She should have said no. She had things to do and a wagon to drive back and chickens to feed. She said yes. The cook's kitchen at the Double Creek house was warm and smelled of wood smoke and coffee, and the good plain smell of a working house in winter. And Mary, who was a wide woman of 50 with a sharp tongue and an apparent complete disregard for anything that was not practically useful, poured them coffee without comment, and then removed herself with the discretion of a woman who had seen enough of life to recognize a moment that needed space. They sat at the kitchen table, Naomi and Jasper Wallace, and they talked for 2 hours. She had not expected that. She had expected the awkwardness of a brief transaction, the exchange of a few polite words, a resolution of the unnamed debt between them, and a clean exit. Instead, they talked. He had come up from the Oklahoma Territory 2 years ago, riding north after spending time working cattle on a series of ranches, looking for steadier work, and finding it at Double Creek under Holt, who was a demanding employer but a fair one. He had grown up in a small town in the territory, the son of a man who had farmed until the land gave out, and he had a farmer's instinctive respect for anyone who was trying to hold onto land in hard circumstances. He asked about the farm. Not in the probing, pitying way people in town asked, but with the genuine technical curiosity of someone who wanted to understand how it worked. How many acres was she planning to put into winter wheat? What was the soil like on the north side where the creek ran through? Had she thought about whether she needed to repair the berm along the eastern field before the spring thaw? She found herself answering in the same practical register, and before she understood what was happening, they were deep in a conversation about crop rotation and drainage that felt, impossibly, more comfortable than any conversation she had managed with anyone since Elijah's death. She left when the light started going early, the way it did in December at 3 in the afternoon. He walked her to the wagon and held the lead horse while she climbed up, and as she gathered the reins he said, without looking at her, "Next Monday it'll have my name on it." She looked down at him. "You don't have to keep going." "I know," he said. She drove home in the early dark and fed her chickens and helped Clara with her reading and made supper. And she thought about Jasper Wallace's dark, careful eyes and the way he had talked about the North Field's drainage as though it personally mattered to him. And she told herself it was nothing. And she told herself this with considerably less conviction than she had managed about the pie. The Monday after Christmas, the sack had a note folded under the cord. It said simply, in a clean, angular handwriting, "J. Wallace," and below that, because apparently he was a man who could not resist, "Hope the chickens are well." She read it twice, and then she laughed, properly laughed, and Clara looked up from the table in startled delight because her mother had not laughed since before Elijah got sick, and the sound of it filled the cold kitchen like something let in from outside. New Year came and went quietly. In January, a hard freeze settled over the county that was worse than anything they had seen in 3 years, the kind of cold that cracked fence posts and froze the water in the pipes, and made the mere act of going outside feel like an argument with God. Naomi's barn stove held, and the chickens held, and the stored grain in the pantry held, and she told herself she was managing because she had been careful and not for any other reason. Jasper Wallace came by on a Tuesday in the middle of January, and it was not a Monday, and there was no sack of grain. He knocked on her front door in the late afternoon with 2 fresh-cut fence rails over his shoulder and the horse at the gate with more wood in the saddlebags, and when she opened the door he said, Your south pasture fence has 2 broken rails I saw when I was coming past on the road. Figured I had the wood." She stood in the doorway for a moment, looking at him in the gray winter light. "You were just coming past," she said. He kept his expression neutral. "It's possible I came a quarter mile out of my way." She opened the door wider and went to get her coat. They fixed the fence together in the cold afternoon, their breath making clouds, working in an easy, wordless rhythm that surprised her. He had brought good nails and a hammer, and she held the rails while he drove the nails, and she noticed without particularly meaning to that he was good with his hands, the kind of competent that came from doing physical work carefully for a long time. They did not talk much while they worked, but the quiet between them was not the empty kind. It was the kind that had substance to it, the kind that comes from 2 people who are comfortable enough not to fill silence for the sake of it. Afterward, she brought him inside and gave him coffee and the last of the apple cake, and Clara, who had been doing her lessons at the kitchen table, looked up at Jasper Wallace with the frank, unself-conscious assessment of a 9-year-old and said, "You're the one who leaves the grain." Naomi went very still. Jasper Wallace looked at Clara with an expression of composed equanimity. "I don't know what you mean, Miss Clara," he said. Clara looked at her mother and back at Jasper. "Mama went to your ranch," she said, with the relentless factual honesty of a child who has not yet learned that adults sometimes prefer the conversation to take a detour. "And she brought you a pie." "That's true," he said. "It was a very good pie." Clara considered him for another moment and then appeared to conclude that he was satisfactory and returned to her lesson. Jasper Wallace caught Naomi's eye across the kitchen table, and he was, clearly, trying not to laugh. And Naomi found herself trying not to laugh as well. And the moment was so ordinary and warm and good that it hurt a little. The way things that are good hurt when you are not sure you are allowed to have them. He came by twice more in January, once to look at the barn roof where she thought there might be a weak spot, and once because there was nothing specific, only a cold Sunday afternoon when the wind had dropped, and he arrived with a cured ham, he said was left over from Holt's Christmas stock, and could she use it? She could use it. She took it without the same conflict she had felt over the grain, and she did not entirely understand why the calculus had changed, except that somewhere between the fence rails and the coffee and her daughter's unsentimental verdict, Jasper Wallace had stopped being a stranger making an anonymous gesture and had become something else, something she did not have a clean word for yet. February came. The cold eased slightly, just enough for the world to remember that spring was a real thing that would happen, and with it came a shift in the particular quality of the tension that Naomi had been carrying in her shoulders for months. She was going to be all right. The farm was going to be all right. She could see the path to planting now, the math worked, the grain stores were adequate, she had a plan for the spring, and it was a good one. The knowledge settled something in her that had been coiled tight since the October burial. On a Thursday afternoon she drove into Caldwell to settle her account at Henderson's mill, which she had been running on credit at 4% since November, and when she came out of the mill onto the main street she nearly walked into Jasper Wallace coming the other direction. He caught her by the elbow to steady her and then let go immediately. "Careful," he said. "Sorry," she said. "I wasn't watching." They stood on the main street of Caldwell in the February light, both of them aware that they were visible to every window and every passing person, and the awareness had a different quality than it might have had 2 months ago, a different charge to it. "Are you heading back out?" he asked. "I was going to stop at the dry goods." "I'll walk with you," he said, "if you don't mind." She did not mind, she minded very much that she did not mind, which was a different problem. They walked to the dry goods, and he held the door and waited outside while she went in. And Martha Delacroix behind the counter had the particular quality of expression that could only be described as delighted. "Jasper Wallace was just in here yesterday," Martha said, handing Naomi her flower with studied casualness. "He asked if I knew whether you needed anything particular for the spring planting." Naomi looked at Martha with an expression she hoped was as unrevealing as a closed door. "Did he?" "He did," Martha said. "I told him I didn't presume to know your business, though I do think it's very kind of him to take an interest." "Martha," Naomi said, "if you tell me what you actually think is happening, we can skip the part where you describe it as kindness." Martha laughed, a genuine, warm laugh, because she had known Naomi Slater for 6 years and she had a deep appreciation for directness. "I think," she said carefully, "that a decent man has been paying attention to a decent woman and that neither of them has said anything about it and that eventually somebody is going to have to." Naomi paid for her flour and said, "Thank you for the insight, Martha," with the tone of a woman closing a door, and she went back outside where Jasper was standing with his shoulder against the post, watching the street. They walked back to her wagon. The street was the ordinary busy street of a February Thursday, freighters moving, horses at the rail, a group of cowboys from one of the outlying ranches coming out of the saloon 2 doors down. Normal Kansas life, nothing exceptional except that Naomi was aware of every step of the way to the wagon of the man walking beside her, the way he moved, the angle of his hat, the easy, unhurried quality of his presence. At the wagon he helped her load the flour without being asked, and then he stood with his hand on the side of the wagon and said without looking at her, "I've been thinking about the Northfield drainage." "So have I," she said. "There's a way to redirect the channel from the creek that would solve it before the thaw. I could come out Saturday if you'd like a second opinion." She turned and looked at him directly. He met her eyes. "Jasper," she said, and it was the first time she had used his first name and they both heard it, "you can come out on Saturday, and it doesn't have to be about the drainage." He was very still for a moment. Then he said, "No, I suppose it doesn't." She drove home. The sun was going down red over the flat prairie, turning the world extraordinary, and Clara was standing on the porch watching for the wagon, and when Naomi climbed down her daughter said, "I saved you the heel of the bread," and Naomi hugged her harder than the occasion seemed to call for, and Clara hugged her back without asking why. Jasper came on Saturday. He came at mid-morning, and he did look at the drainage, and they walked the Northfield together in the gray February weather, and he showed her what he had been thinking about the channel, and she told him what she had been thinking, and they disagreed pleasantly about one section, and then agreed on a solution. And it was all entirely sensible and practical, and also they were walking very close together in the way that had stopped being about proximity to the field, and had become about something else entirely. They went inside when the cold got too much and Clara made them both tea with a focused seriousness that suggested she had been thinking about this, and then she went outside to check on the chickens with a diplomacy that was impressive in a 9-year-old. Jasper stood at the kitchen window, watching Clara cross the yard. "She's a good girl," he said. "She's the best person I know," Naomi said, "and I'm including all the adults." He turned from the window. The kitchen was warm and full of the smell of the tea and the wood stove, and the winter light came through the window at a low angle and made everything look soft and a little golden. He looked at her across the kitchen with those careful dark eyes, and she looked back, and the moment had the quality of something arriving after a long journey. "I want to keep coming out here," he said, "not just for the grain or the fence rails." "I know," she said. "I thought you should hear it said plainly," he said, and the faint self-consciousness in it, the way a straightforward man sounds when he is saying something that costs him, made something in her chest pull loose from its careful moorings. "I'm glad you said it," she said. "I am not entirely sure what I'm ready for. It has not been a long time since I lost my husband." "I know that," he said, and he meant it. The sincerity of it was obvious. He was not pushing. "But I don't want you to stop coming out here," she said. "I want to say that clearly, too." He nodded once with the gravity of a man receiving something of value. "Then I'll keep coming." She walked him to his horse when he left in the early afternoon, and at the horse he turned and held out his hand, and she took it, and they shook hands like it was a proper agreement between two people, which she supposed it was, And then he rode away down the road, and she stood at the gate and watched him go and thought, for the first time since October, that the future had something in it she was actually interested in. March came on with the particular willfulness of a Kansas spring, which is to say it could not make up its mind between winter and warmth, and changed its opinion 3 times a day. There were mornings of brilliant pale sunshine that made the muddy fields look like hammered bronze, and afternoons of sudden cold that sent everyone inside with their coats, and evenings of a particular clear chill that smelled like green things coming up under the frozen ground, the first insistent intimation of the world returning to life. Naomi had 3 things to manage in March. She had the early planting preparation, which meant getting the fields turned before the ground froze again, checking and repairing tools, and assessing the berm along the east field that Jasper had identified as a priority. She had Clara, who had caught a chest cold in late February that had improved, but left her with a cough that Naomi watched with the vigilant, slightly terrified attention of a mother who had just spent 6 weeks watching her husband's health decline, even though the doctor had been clear that it was nothing serious. And she had Jasper Wallace, who had come out on Saturday and Sunday of the first 2 weeks of March, and once on a Wednesday evening when the light lingered late enough to justify it, and who was becoming part of the rhythm of the farm in a way that she was no longer making any effort to pretend she did not welcome. He had fixed the berm. He had spent most of a Saturday at it, working with a shovel and a pickaxe and a focused, systematic thoroughness that she had watched from the field while doing her own work. And when it was done, he had come to find her and showed her the redirected drainage channel and explained what he had done and why. And she had understood the practical reasoning entirely, and also she had been aware the whole time of his hands and the solid, certain way he occupied his own body. On the second Sunday of March, Clara's cold was worse and she was inside in bed, and Naomi and Jasper sat together on the porch in the pale afternoon sun after checking on her, and it was the first time they had been sitting with nothing particular to do, no task, no problem to solve, no piece of the farm demanding their attention. It should have been awkward, and it was not. They sat and drank coffee and watched the field and the sky and the first tentative green coming up along the road, and Jasper told her about growing up in the territory, the long flat summers and the particular loneliness of remote land, and the way his father had talked about crops, with the mix of love and frustration of a man in a difficult relationship with something he could not leave. She told him about meeting Elijah, the summer she was 19, at a church dance that neither of them had particularly wanted to attend, and both had been dragged to by family, and how he had been the worst dancer she had ever seen and had known it and laughed about it freely, and that the laugh had been the thing, that particular ease with his own imperfection. She told Jasper this carefully, not because she was trying to warn him or establish terms, but because Elijah was part of her history and her farm and her daughter, and any true understanding of who she was had to include him. Jasper listened in the way he did everything, with complete, uncrowded attention. "He sounds like someone worth knowing," he said when she finished. "He was," she said. "He was one of the best." A pause. The wind moved the new grass at the edge of the yard. "I'm not trying to replace anything," Jasper said quietly. "I know that," she said. "I know it." She reached across the space between the 2 chairs and put her hand over his where it rested on the arm of the chair, and he turned his hand over and held hers, and they sat like that in the pale March sunlight without saying anything else, and it was enough. It was more than enough. It was something she had not been sure she would ever feel again, this specific warmth of being held in a world that had felt very cold for a long time. April arrived with conviction. The ground softened, the planting preparation went into full swing, and for 3 weeks Naomi was moving from before dawn until after dark every single day, doing the work that Elijah had shared with her, and that she was now doing alone, or mostly alone, because on 4 of those days Jasper arrived in the early morning and worked beside her. He was a good farmhand as well as a horseman. Better, in fact, than she had expected from a man who had spent most of his working life on cattle ranches. He could drive a furrow as straight as anyone she had worked with, and he knew how to calibrate the seed depth by feel and how to check the soil temperature with 2 fingers in the dirt, and whether it was time to plant or time to wait another week. On the days he was there, the work went faster and the silences between tasks were easy, and sometimes something she said made him laugh, a real laugh, not performed, and she found she was working toward it deliberately, toward the small pleasure of making Jasper Wallace laugh. One April morning she found him in the barn with Clara. He had come early and she had been in the field, and Clara had found him first. And when Naomi came in from checking the eastern field border, she found them in deep consultation over a hen that had gone broody and was sitting on a nest with the composed intractability of a sitting hen. Clara was explaining the situation with great seriousness, and Jasper was crouched down listening, and the picture of them together, the small serious girl and the patient man, was so uncomplicated and warm that Naomi stood in the barn door for a moment doing nothing, just looking. Clara said, "Mama, Jasper says if she's determined to sit we should let her and mark the eggs." "Jasper is right," Naomi said and came in. She caught Jasper's eye, and he had the particular careful neutral expression of a man who is aware he has been caught in something, but does not know the nature of it. That evening, after the planting work and after supper and after Clara was in bed, Jasper did not leave immediately. It was the first time that had happened, the first time he had stayed into the evening past the work, and he sat at the kitchen table with his coffee while she washed the supper dishes, and they talked in the low voices that evening kitchens seemed to naturally produce, talking about the planting and the spring and what the season looked like, and the odds that the next Monday sack of grain was going to keep coming now that she had adequate stores. It was never just about the grain, he said, and there was no pretense in it. She dried her hands on the cloth and turned around and looked at him across the kitchen. The lamp was burning on the table and the light was warm and yellow, and outside the Kansas night was full of spring sounds, frogs from the creek and the wind in the new grass and the occasional distant sound of the world being alive again after winter. "Jasper," she said, "I have been a widow for 6 months." "I know," he said. "And I find that I am more interested in you than I have been in anything that isn't my daughter or this farm since well before my husband died," she said, with the direct precision of a woman who had thought about how she wanted to say something and was saying it that way. "And I think you know that. I think you've known it for a little while." He stood up from the table. He was not a tall man, but he had the quality of stillness that made him seem, in moments like this, large in the room. "I know it," he said. "Then I am not going to pretend otherwise any more," she said. "I think it would be a waste of time, and I have lost enough time." He crossed the kitchen in 3 steps and took her face in his hands, and he kissed her with a tenderness so careful and unhurried that she felt it in every part of her that had been cold and closed and surviving. And when it ended, she kept her eyes closed for a moment, because she needed a second to put herself back together. "I should go," he said quietly, "because Clara is asleep and this is your house and I have some respect for the proper shape of things." "You should go," she agreed, and she did not let go of the front of his coat. He kissed her once more, briefly, and then she let him go, and she heard the horse leave the yard with that same unhurried walk she had heard in the dark before dawn on that Monday morning in November, and she stood in her warm kitchen and pressed her hands flat against the table and breathed, and she was more thoroughly alive than she had been in a very long time. May came in green and gorgeous. The wheat was in the ground and growing. The broody hen had hatched 8 chicks to Clara's profound delight. The kitchen garden was flourishing. The farm, which had seemed in October like a thing that might break, was holding together, and more than holding. It was working, it was producing, it was becoming once again what it had been in the best years before the illness, a living and fruitful place. Jasper came on Sundays now, and on whatever other day he could manage. And their relationship had the quality that Naomi had not expected but was grateful for, which was ease. There was no drama and no anxiety and no performance, just two people who were genuinely interested in each other and who had both been through enough hard things to understand that what they had was valuable and not to be treated carelessly. They talked about everything. They disagreed sometimes, about farming decisions and occasionally about other things. And disagreeing with Jasper was satisfying in a way she had not anticipated, because he listened to counterarguments with the same careful attention he gave to everything and sometimes changed his mind and said so, plainly. He told her about the territory, more than he had told her in the winter, about the particular kind of injustice that had been done to the people who had lived on that land long before anyone else arrived, the forced removal, the treaty promises broken and rebroken, the way an entire world had been dismantled to make room for the expanding ambitions of settlers who were told they had a right to it. He had grown up watching it and had not had words for it then, and had the words for it now, and the words were grim and clear. He said it without anger but also without the excusing softness that she had heard some men use when they talked about such things, the way of describing injustice that made it sound inevitable and therefore acceptable. She respected that. She had her own thoughts about it, having grown up in a Kansas that had been, within living memory, someone else's home, and she did not pretend otherwise. "The world is full of things that were done wrong," she said one Sunday afternoon in May, sitting on the porch while the field greened itself in front of them, "and most of them cannot be undone now, but you can at least see them clearly." "Seeing them clearly is the least you can do," he said. "It doesn't fix anything, but it's the minimum of honesty," she nodded. Clara was in the yard with the chicks conducting what appeared to be a census. The light was gold and warm, the kind of May light that is the argument for Kansas against everyone who has said hard things about the place, the light that makes the flat land look like a painting of itself. "Jasper," she said without looking at him, "what do you want? Not for the farm or for the season, for yourself." He was quiet for a moment. "I want to stop working for someone else's ranch," he said. "I've been doing it long enough to know I'm not built to keep doing it forever. I want ground of my own. I want to put something down and watch it come up and know it's mine." "Do you have money saved?" she asked practically. "Some, not enough to buy outright, enough for a start maybe." She looked at him then, and he was looking at the field, and she said carefully, "This farm needs a hand, not a hired hand, a proper hand, a permanent one." He turned and looked at her. The light was on his face, and his eyes were the careful dark eyes that she had watched in firelight and winter sun and the pale gold of spring, and she held his gaze without blinking. "Naomi," he said, and the way he said her name was its own kind of declaration. "I'm not asking you to do me a kindness," she said. "I'm telling you what I want because I have been clear about what I want since I gave you back that pie. I want you here. I want this to be a thing we build together, and I want to do it properly, the right way, if you're willing." He was very still for a long moment, the way he was when something mattered, the absolute quality of attention that was entirely his own. "I have to speak to Clara first," he said. She blinked, not because she had not thought of it, but because she had not expected him to be the one to name it. "Yes," she said, "you do." He stood up from the porch chair and walked down the steps into the yard, and Naomi watched from the porch as he crossed to Clara, who was presiding over her chicks with great authority, and crouched down to her level and said something. Clara looked at him with the direct, unblinking assessment she had deployed on him the first day in the kitchen, and then she said something back, and Jasper nodded, and then Clara, to Naomi's absolute astonishment, reached out and patted Jasper Wallace on the arm in a gesture that was so obviously and precisely the gesture of a small person, offering comfort and approval that Naomi had to look away for a moment because her eyes were filling. Jasper came back to the porch. He was not smiling exactly, but the quality of his face had changed. It was open in a way she had not seen before. "She said," he told her, standing at the porch steps with his hat in his hands, that she thinks it would be good to have someone around who is useful. Naomi laughed. That is the most accurate possible endorsement. She also said, he added, and now there was a real smile, that she wants to name the rooster. She already named the rooster, Naomi said. She named him again. She named him Jasper. Naomi laughed harder, and he laughed too, and the sound of the two of them laughing together in the May sunshine on the porch of the farm that was going to survive its first bad year carried out across the field and into the warm Kansas air. And Clara in the yard said loudly, "What is funny?" And neither of them could explain it clearly, which made it worse, or better, which were sometimes the same thing. He proposed to her on a Sunday in June, between the morning's work and the midday meal, in the north field beside the drainage channel he had redirected in the spring, which was neither a romantic location nor a romantic piece of business, and yet was, somehow, precisely right. He had been thinking about it for weeks. She could see it in the way he had been a fraction quieter than usual for the past 2 Sundays, gathering himself toward something. He asked her simply and directly, with the same plain honesty he brought to everything, holding her hands in his work-roughened ones with the same careful gentleness he had shown since the very first morning he had touched her hands across a pie wrapped in cloth. She said yes before he had entirely finished asking, and the smile that broke across his face was the most unguarded thing she had ever seen from a man who guarded himself carefully. And it was worth 6 months of cold mornings, and hard arithmetic and the particular effort of staying upright when everything wanted to pull her down. They were married in August of 1883, in the white clapboard church on the edge of Caldwell that she had attended since she arrived in Kansas, on a day of brilliant summer heat that turned the prairie gold and made the air shimmer. Clara was the witness, standing beside her mother in a new dress they had made together out of cloth Naomi had woven over the winter, blue cotton with small white flowers, and she held Naomi's bouquet of the wild prairie flowers she had gathered herself that morning, with a concentrated dignity that made several of the attending women produce handkerchiefs. Martha Delacroix was there, radiating satisfaction. Margaret Holt from the Ladies' Aid Society was there and embraced Naomi warmly afterward, and if there was any "I told you so" quality in the embrace, it was mild enough to forgive. Henderson from the mill came. The cook Mary from the Double Creek Ranch came and brought the best cake in the county, because she had made up her mind about this situation in January when she had poured them coffee and removed herself, and she was pleased to see her judgment confirmed. Jasper's friend and colleague from the Double Creek Ranch, the raw-boned young man named Pete who had pointed Naomi toward the far corral on that December morning, was Jasper's best man and wore his good shirt and tried very hard not to cry and failed in the last 30 seconds. They said their vows in front of the whole community of Caldwell, Kansas in the summer heat, and Naomi looked at Jasper Wallace while she was saying them and he looked back at her with those careful, honest, steady eyes, and she thought, with the kind of clarity you only get when you have earned it, this is real. This is true. This is a man who left grain on my porch in the dark and asked for nothing, and I am going to spend the rest of my life building something with him, and it is going to be good. It was good. The autumn of 1883 was better than the autumn of 1882 had been in every measurable way. The harvest came in strong, the best the farm had produced in 2 years, because the drainage repairs had done what Jasper had predicted they would do, and the redirected channel had kept the north field from waterlogging in the wet spring. They sold what they did not need and paid Henderson the rest of what they owed him, and by October they had settled every outstanding account and had money in the tin box, which Naomi had moved from behind the flour sacks to the shelf above the fireplace, because it no longer needed to hide. Jasper had resigned from the Double Creek Ranch in July, giving Holt the proper notice and leaving on good terms, because he was the kind of man who managed endings with the same care he brought to beginnings. Holt had shaken his hand and told him he was a fool for leaving steady wages for a widow's farm, but the handshake had been sincere, and Holt had sent over a bull calf as a wedding gift, which was the sort of practical generosity that made Naomi revise her opinion of the man. The farm was now both of theirs. Jasper's name went on the deed beside Naomi's when they filed the amended papers in Caldwell, and seeing the two names there together, Naomi Slater Wallace and Jasper Thomas Wallace, had a solidity and a rightness to it that the tin box moved to the open shelf had also had, the quality of a thing brought out of hiding and placed in the light. Clara thrived. She had started the Caldwell school again in September, walking the 2 miles into town 3 days a week with the serious purposefulness she brought to everything. And she had come home in the second week, announcing that she had been asked to help the younger students with their reading, because she was the best reader in the school, which Naomi greeted with appropriate maternal restraint while being privately delighted. Jasper helped her with her arithmetic in the evenings, which was not a skill that had previously featured prominently in his life, but which he approached with the same patient thoroughness he applied to everything, and Clara's arithmetic improved dramatically. In November, on a Monday morning, because of course it was a Monday, Naomi came downstairs to find Jasper already in the kitchen with the stove going and 2 cups of coffee on the table and an expression of deliberate neutrality on his face. "I have put a sack on the porch," he said. She stopped in the kitchen doorway. "Jasper, we have grain." "I know," he said. "It's not grain, go look." She went to the front porch. On the second step, in the exact place where the first anonymous sack had appeared on a November morning a year ago, there was a small wooden box, plain and neatly made, with a cord around it. She picked it up. It was heavy, heavier than it looked. She untied the cord and opened it, and inside, nestled in straw, were a set of matching silver hairpins, the kind she had admired once in passing at the dry goods store and not bought because they were not a practical expenditure, and below them, wrapped in a piece of cloth, was a small carved wooden rooster. She looked at the rooster for a moment, and then she started laughing. She was laughing when she came back inside and she held up the carved rooster, and Jasper was leaning against the kitchen counter with his arms folded and the unguarded smile she had been accumulating since May. "For the name," he said. "You carved this," she said. "I have been carving it since August." She crossed the kitchen and kissed him properly, with the rooster in one hand and the hairpins in the other, and he put his arms around her and held her in the warm kitchen that smelled of coffee and the wood stove, and she thought about the distance between that first Monday morning and this one, the strange and winding path from a nameless sack on a cold November porch to this kitchen, this man, this life. "You are entirely ridiculous," she told him. "Probably," he agreed, and kissed her again. Winter that year was gentler than the year before, or perhaps it only seemed so because the house was different, fuller and warmer, with 2 adults and a child, and all the ordinary beloved noise of a working family in a working house. Jasper had brought very little with him from the bunkhouse at Double Creek. He traveled light in the way of men who had spent years moving, but he had a few books and his tools and a good saddle and a photograph of his parents that he put on the shelf beside Naomi's photograph of Elijah. She had been the one to suggest it, and he had looked at her for a long, quiet moment before accepting. The photograph of Elijah stayed on the shelf. She had asked Jasper once if it bothered him, and he had said, without hesitation, "He's Clara's father, and he was your husband for 7 years. He belongs in this house." It was one of many things he said that she stored up privately in the way you store things that are too valuable to display constantly, taking them out to look at, and then putting them safely away again. Clara received a letter from her school teacher in February of 1884 noting that she was performing at a level well above her age group, and asking whether her parents had considered whether she might benefit from more advanced study. Naomi and Jasper sat at the kitchen table with the letter and looked at each other and had a conversation that went on for 2 evenings and covered the practical questions of cost and travel and the impractical questions of what Clara herself wanted, and arrived at the conclusion that they would ask Clara directly, which they did. And Clara said she wanted to learn as much as she possibly could because she intended to be a doctor. Naomi absorbed this. Jasper said calmly, "Then we'll need to start thinking about that." Clara looked at him with the expression she reserved for things that met her standard of adequacy. "Yes," she said, "we will." Naomi looked at her daughter and at her husband across the kitchen table and felt the specific, quiet joy of a life that is working at all its joints. By the spring of 1884, Naomi was sure she was expecting. She told Jasper on a Sunday morning before breakfast, standing in the kitchen in her nightgown, because she had decided to tell him right away and had not bothered to dress first. And his reaction was the one she had hoped for and more. A stillness, and then a quality of careful, full wonder that she had not seen on his face before. A new expression entirely, and he pulled her in and held her for a long time without speaking. "A boy, I think," she said from against his shoulder with no particular basis for this. "Could be," he said. "Could be a girl. Could be either," she agreed. "I hope it is healthy and I hope it has your eyes," he laughed softly. "Your eyes," he said. "Your eyes are nicer." "They are the same color," she said. "Yours have more in them," he said, and kissed the top of her head. She told Clara that afternoon, and Clara took the information in and processed it with visible seriousness, and then said that she had 3 conditions: that she got to help pick the name, that the baby was not allowed in her room without permission, and that she would not be expected to change diapers. Naomi accepted conditions 1 and 2. Condition 3 was negotiated. The summer of 1884 was hot and full. The farm was expanding in the careful, incremental way of a thing growing into its full potential. Jasper had added a second pasture and was running 3 cattle alongside the chickens and the kitchen garden, and they had planted a larger acreage of wheat than the previous year, and the crop was looking strong. The work was substantial, and Naomi did as much of it as the pregnancy allowed, which was more than Jasper was comfortable with and less than she wanted to do, and they negotiated this boundary on an almost weekly basis. He fussed over her in a way that was entirely without condescension, the specific concern of a person who had come to understand that the person they loved was the most practically competent person in the room, and who worried anyway not because of doubt, but because of the sheer value of what was at risk. She found his fussing both unnecessary and deeply pleasant, and felt somewhat hypocritical for both reactions simultaneously. The baby arrived in November of 1884, 4 days after the anniversary of that first grain sack, which Naomi noted privately as the kind of coincidence that the world produces with neither intention nor apology. It was a boy, as she had predicted, a healthy and immediately opinionated boy who announced his presence in the world with a volume that startled the doctor and appeared to amuse Jasper, who was holding Naomi's hand through the whole of it with an expression of absolute focused attention. They named him Elijah Thomas Wallace. Elijah for the man who had loved this farm and built this house and given it everything he had. Thomas for Jasper's father, who had farmed the hard land of the territory until it would no longer farm. The 2 names together felt right, a bridge between what had been and what was. Clara inspected her half-brother with the critical attentiveness of a physician and declared him acceptable. She did not touch him for the first 2 weeks, observing from what she considered an appropriate distance, and then one morning Naomi found her sitting in the rocker with little Elijah in her arms, talking to him in a low, instructional voice about the digestive system. "Clara," Naomi said from the doorway. "I'm teaching him early," Clara said. "It's never too early. He is 3 weeks old." "The principles are the same," Clara said. Life settled into the rhythms of a family house with a new baby, which is to say it became more complicated and more exhausting and more full of small moments of grace than anything Naomi had experienced before, including the year of survival. Jasper was a father in the same way he was everything else: present, patient, consistent, and genuinely interested. He did not perform fatherhood. He simply did it. The night wakings and the rough mornings and the long patient work of a person, figuring out another person who cannot yet talk. He and Clara developed, over the winter of Elijah's first months, a relationship that was becoming its own thing. Not quite father and daughter, but not nothing either. A warm and mutual respect between two people who were both naturally precise and both slightly suspicious of excess sentiment, and who had therefore reached an understanding largely on the basis of shared practical values. Clara would leave for advanced study in Wichita in the autumn of 1886, when she was 12, boarding with a family Naomi knew through the church and attending the better school there. Jasper drove her in the wagon and carried her trunk and stood at the gate of the boarding house looking at her with the expression of a man who has something to say and is choosing not to because the moment does not need it. Clara shook his hand and then, surprising them both, hugged him briefly and precisely, one firm press and then release, and turned and went inside without looking back because looking back was not something Clara did. Jasper came back to the wagon where Naomi was waiting and they drove home in the September afternoon, and he held her hand on the seat and she leaned against him and looked at the prairie going past and thought about the 10-year-old girl who had taken down the name of a grain sack leaving Cowboy and declared him useful, who was going to be a doctor, because when Clara Slater decided something was going to happen, it happened. "She'll be fine," Jasper said. "She'll be extraordinary," Naomi said. He squeezed her hand, that too. They came home to little Elijah, who was 2 and had recently discovered that the chickens could be herded, and was pursuing this hobby with the same systematic enthusiasm that characterized the family in general. And the house was full of the comfortable evening sounds of a farm at end of day. And Naomi stood at the kitchen stove making supper, while Jasper bathed Elijah and Elijah expressed his views about this at some volume. And she thought about November of 1882. The cold porch and the grief and the iron determination not to accept anything that came with a face attached to it. She thought about a man on horseback in the dark, setting something down with careful hands and touching his hat to an empty window. She thought about how much she had not known then, how much she had not been able to see. In the years that followed, the farm grew steadily into a substantial operation. By 1888, they were running a proper mixed farm, wheat and cattle and a kitchen garden and poultry, with 2 hired hands in the harvest season and a reputation in Caldwell for the best winter wheat in the county. Jasper had turned out to be, in addition to everything else, a natural businessman, not in the slick-talking way of the cattle speculators who came through town, but in the patient, careful way of someone who understood that value was built in increments, and that trust was the most useful currency there was. The farm's reputation spread. Other farmers came to talk to him about the drainage methods he had developed, and he answered their questions without concealment because he did not believe in hoarding knowledge. Naomi had become, over those years, something that the town of Caldwell referred to without irony as a fixture. She was on the school board. She was a founding member of the county agricultural cooperative. She had a reputation for absolute, occasionally uncomfortable honesty and for practical competence, and she was one of the first people anyone came to when there was a problem that needed solving rather than commiserating. She did not take charity. She did not offer it either, preferring instead the kind of help that had its own dignity, that came without a face full of pity, that was offered and accepted on the basis of one person with something to give and another with something to need, simple and clean. The Ladies' Aid Society had given up trying to include her in their charity drives years ago and instead channeled her toward their practical projects, where she was significantly more useful. In the spring of 1889, a letter arrived from Wichita in Clara's precise, angular handwriting. She had been accepted to the program in St. Louis that would complete her medical training. She would be the youngest admitted to date and one of only 3 women. She needed them to know. She did not ask for anything, Naomi read the letter at the kitchen table 3 times, carefully, and then set it down and folded her hands on top of it and sat very quietly. Jasper came in from outside and saw her expression and sat down across from her. "Good news or bad news?" he said. She pushed the letter across to him without speaking. He read it. He read it again. Then he set it down and looked at her, and she looked at him, and his eyes were bright, and she was certain hers were the same. "She's going to be a doctor," he said. "She's going to be a doctor," Naomi confirmed. Little Elijah, who was 4 and extremely interested in what the grown-ups were doing, climbed into Naomi's lap and demanded to know what the paper said. And Naomi told him his sister was going to be a doctor, and Elijah said, "Like the doctor who comes when people are sick." And Naomi said, "Just like that." And Elijah considered this and said, "Good," with the decisive solidity of a small person who has rendered a verdict, and then climbed down and went back outside. Jasper was laughing. Naomi was laughing. The kitchen was full of late spring light coming through the window, and the field outside was green and growing, and the tin box on the shelf above the fireplace was full and had been for years. In the summer of 1889, Naomi found out she was expecting their second child. The news arrived with the same certainty it had the first time, and she told Jasper the same way, in the kitchen on a Sunday morning before the world had properly started. He held her the same way he had the first time, with that careful, full wonder, but there was more of something now, more ease in it, more confidence, the sureness of a man who knows the ground he's standing on. "This one will be different," he said, meaning the arrival of a baby with a toddler in the house. "This one will be chaos," she said, "and it will be wonderful." It was a girl, born in February of 1890, with Naomi's eyes and what appeared to be Jasper's stubborn deliberateness, even in infancy. They named her Rose, for no particular literary reason, only because when Naomi looked at her, she thought of the wild prairie roses that came up along the fence line every June without being planted, persistent and thorny, and entirely themselves. Elijah's reaction to his sister was 3 days of suspicious observation, followed by a proprietorial affection that he never verbally acknowledged, but demonstrated continuously through the practice of placing himself between Rose and any perceived threat, including the chickens, which he had reversed position on and now regarded as untrustworthy. Clara came home for Christmas of 1890 from St. Louis. She was 16, tall like her father had been, with Naomi's directness and her own particular quality of focused, reserved warmth. She met baby Rose with the same clinical assessment she had applied to infant Elijah and declared her healthy. She sat with Jasper in the evenings, and they talked about medicine and farming and the particular overlap between them, the biology of soil and growth, with the mutual pleasure of 2 people who are genuinely interested in the world. She read to Elijah and allowed him to sit beside her on the settee, which was a significant gesture from Clara, and Elijah knew it and sat very still so as not to lose the privilege. On Christmas night, after the children were in bed and the fire was burning low, Naomi and Jasper sat together on the settee in the warm, quiet house that was entirely and completely theirs, that had been built from grief and grain and pride, and the particular stubbornness of a woman who would not accept what was given, and the specific tenderness of a man who found a way around that. "Do you remember the first sack?" she said. "Not for any particular reason. It was the kind of thing that comes up on a quiet night by a fire, the past presenting itself for acknowledgement. Every detail," he said. He was looking at the fire, and the light moved across his face, and he was 35 years old and looked it, with the weathering of years of outdoor work and the particular settled quality that came from a man who had found his place and knew it. "I almost drove it to town," she said. "The first one. I almost loaded it in the wagon and went to find whoever left it." "I know," he said. "I was aware that was a risk." She looked at him. "You were not confident I would keep it." "I was not confident at all," he said, with the honesty she had come to rely on. "I was confident it was the right thing to do and not at all confident it would work." What would you have done if I had returned it?" He was quiet for a moment, watching the fire. "Left it again the next week," he said, "and the week after that." She studied his profile, the clean line of jaw and the slight forward tilt of his head that meant he was thinking, and she felt the specific, layered love that was not the sharp first thing but was deeper and better and built on years of ordinary mornings and difficult seasons and choices made together in good faith. "Jasper," she said. He turned to look at her. "I am glad I did not return it," she said. He reached out and tucked a strand of hair back from her face gently, and his hand rested against her cheek for a moment. "So am I," he said, "more than I have words for." She leaned against him and he put his arm around her and they sat by the fire while the Kansas winter moved against the windows of the house that had survived everything, that had been grief and hardship and determination, and two good people finding each other in the dark with nothing but a sack of grain and a hat touched to an empty window, and it was, in the end and in every way that mattered, more than enough. The winter wheat was already in the ground. The drainage channels held. The children were sleeping. The tin box on the shelf was full, and the names on the deed were right, and outside the window the flat Kansas land spread out in every direction under a sky full of cold stars. The same sky it had always been, indifferent and gorgeous, the land that had taken and given back and taken again and given back again. The way land does when you stay with it long enough to understand that survival and love are not different things but the same thing, only the survival comes first. They stayed by the fire long after it burned low, talking sometimes and sometimes not, and the house was quiet around them with the good deep quiet of a life that had settled into itself, and there was nothing left undone and nothing left unsaid that needed saying. And the morning would come early and there would be work and the children would wake and the farm would require everything they had, and it would be enough. It always had been. It always would be. Outside, the rooster Clara had named Jasper, the third generation of that particular naming tradition, stood on the fence post in the cold night air, and was entirely unaware of the significance of anything which was, Naomi thought later, the most honest possible witness to a love story. Something alive and simple and completely indifferent to narrative, just standing in the dark, warm and real.